Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński and you're watching TVP World Talks, where every word matters. Christmas, a time of joy, caring and sharing. And if you happen to live at the Kremlin, apparently also a time of sending missile barrages to your neighbour in a dark twist on the theme of gift-giving. On Christmas Day, Russian missiles and drones rained down on civilian targets in Ukraine, including the city of Kharkiv, causing more misery and more destruction. Shortly thereafter, the Biden administration vowed to send additional weapons to Ukraine to boost its self-defense capabilities. Retired General Keith Kellog, Trump's pick for Special Envoy to Ukraine and Russia, likewise criticized the deadly attack, but questions remain as to how the new Trump administration will handle aid to Ukraine after taking power. So is the latest surge of arms to Kyiv the last of its kind, or will the US have little choice once it has learned that Russia simply has no interest in negotiating in good faith? Joining us now to discuss this and more is Chris Morris from the University of Portsmouth. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello and thank you for having me.
So what do you think about this announcement? Is this a last-ditched attempt at basically securing Ukraine against a possible decrease in the amount of arms provided to it under Donald Trump? Or is it simply President Biden trying to do the right thing, given that what has happened there, even by Russian standards, was horrifying?
It certainly seems that what Biden is trying to accomplish at the moment is to pump as much funding into Ukraine as possible to, offset the potential drawdown that we could see under Trump. So that certainly seems to be the case. Now, of course, attacks like the one that has just taken place over Christmas are alarming, but unfortunately this has been, a typical Russian approach over the last couple of years. Winning on the front line is something that they can accomplish occasionally, but when they do accomplish a victory on the front line, it comes at an astronomical cost. So once again, we can see that Russia is focusing in on the civilian population, trying to make them freeze through the winter. Very unfortunate, but again, this is a time-worn strategy that the Russians employ.
So naturally, Russia is terrorizing the civilian population, and it is not as if Russia didn't know that Ukrainians are celebrating Christmas. The Orthodox Church does not celebrate Christmas at the same time as, say, the Catholics do. But still, it's all over the media. Christmas is something that everyone understands, apparently, apart from Vladimir Putin. So what would you say is going to be Trump's move in this regard? We had Keith Kellog saying Christmas is a time of peace and condemning this attack. Will this be any indication of what is to come?
Yes, I very much doubt that Putin is going to be respecting January the 7th either, the Orthodox Christmas. Whilst alarming, this is not really exceptional for Russia. These attacks have been going on throughout the conflict, and the fact that they're not respecting Christmas, again, is something that you should expect when dealing with the Russians. In terms of reaction from Trump, that's still very much up in the air. Now, whilst his position has shifted somewhat over the last month, he's still adamant at bringing this war to a close. Now, we still have no idea what that is going to look like. Now, maybe once he starts getting to grips with the Russian and starts attempting to negotiate with them, we might see his position on the conflict change rather radically. Unfortunately, however, as very much Trumpian, unfortunately, we do not have any idea what his negotiating position actually is or how he intends to bring this conflict to a close. So at the moment, we're dealing with something of a wild card when it comes to the future of Ukraine, which, is in many ways less than optimal for everybody.
How is Russia positioning itself for the negotiations? I'm talking about the battlefield successes, but also about the complete disregard of international norms and safety. Russia is not trying to downplay what it does in Ukraine. It is attacking civilians on Christmas Day. Also, the tragedy involving the Azerbaijani airliner is not going to improve their image in the eyes of the international community.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, it's going to be very interesting to see what Russia's bargaining position in the anticipated, talks is going to look like. Now, you could say that they're doing a very effective job of kind of positioning themselves as this kind of mad dog that is going to build this condition or continue building this condition of disorder, chaos, and death unless it is adequately appeased. So that is a very likely position for, a man of Putin's caliber in the forthcoming negotiations.
Would you say that the Trump administration is simply unlikely to be able to ignore all these signals, I mean, apart from the war in Ukraine, we have hybrid Russian activity in the Baltic. We should still file this under suspected, but there are just too many incidents occurring recently with undersea cables being damaged. So you have the totality of Russian activity. Would you say that, to some extent, American foreign policy is determined by interests, and these interests are not really changing?
Yes, naturally. A big shift that we're probably going to see is, again, like, the US is going to be very concerned by its interests. Unfortunately for us Europeans, those interests seem increasingly concentrated on the US southern border and the US homeland. So whilst this is an absolute tragedy for both, America's global reach and its position in the world, it's probably going to pale in comparison to the focus that they're going to bring to their own domestic problems over the coming months and years. So, yeah, whilst this is a major challenge for the US, I imagine they're going to probably be looking a lot closer to home when it comes to their security interests. And at the end of the day, when it comes to defense spending, it's a zero-sum game. For everything that they refocus on the American homeland, that's going to mean, less spent on Ukraine, less spent, shoring up Europe against potential aggression, which is worrying as a European. Interestingly, Trump is kind of floating some strategies out there as well, which, could really compound Ukraine's problems. For instance, Trump is looking for an ever-increasing commitment from European nations in terms of NATO spending. Now, Ukraine's European supporters could find themselves facing a very stark choice in the coming months. They could be looking at, we need to up our own defense spending in order to win, trade concessions from the US. And that's going to really tie their hands when it comes to building these support packages for Ukraine. So, yeah, it could be the perfect storm in terms of, funding drying up.
But to some extent, wouldn't you say that when it comes to Western European countries, they are simply being awakened out of a dream that they have been dreaming for the last decade at least? I mean, countries in Eastern Europe, Poland, for example, is increasing its military spending, and it has been able to help Ukraine during the very first months of the war. We actually supported Ukraine massively with over 400 tanks, for example. So, like, Western European countries might see, well, it's doable. It's just about them being able to prioritize things. I mean, these are massive, powerful economies. All of the European economies combined, much bigger than Russia. So is there any excuse for them not to do this?
It's interesting you say that some nations are waking up. Some nations, unfortunately, are still very much asleep. Now, in many Western European countries, whilst the Ukraine war has really hammered home that, conflict is something that can happen here, this disorder still seems very remote to many people in Europe. Many European nations are dealing with, many domestic problems at the moment. And on top of that as well, you've also got to factor in that European economies are persistently stagnating at the moment. So even if they up, spending in terms of percentage of their GDP, the uplift is going to be minimal. Of course, you do have nations like Poland who are absolutely leading the way. And, it would be an absolute nightmare if suddenly Poland was bordering Russia, which, is still a foreseeable outcome. Maybe not in the next few years, but if we do not send a clear message to Russia now, then, we could be contending with a very undesirable situation down the line. It's definitely time for Europe to start stepping up on defense matters. And that's one thing that even Donald Trump is right about.
Also, wouldn't you say that this, to some extent, will constitute a useful investment? Europe will be investing in its own security and also boosting its defense industry, which, I mean, it has been wound down to some extent, but, I mean, the capabilities still exist, don't they? So shouldn't this be perhaps formulated in, as a calculation of cost? Like, you invest now, you pay later. Because it's going to be more expensive to contain Russia further down the line.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And you only have to look at what Ukraine has managed to accomplish so far. Now, in terms of, an American expedition to fight Russia, what the Ukrainians have been able to accomplish is astronomical. And I will stress as well, for pennies on the dollar when you would compare it to a direct US deployment. Now, again, investments now are going to pay dividends down the line. And again, even if there was a peace settlement with Russia or some kind of freezing of the front lines, you would need to see immense investment in, Ukrainian forces, Ukrainian military infrastructure, and the Ukrainian state to vouchsafe that nation against any further Russian expansion. So really, there's no viable way out of this conflict. There's no viable future that does not involve, a long-term military investment in the region.
Some would argue that there was a viable way out back in 2022. Send more weapons to Ukraine, allow it to win. There was an opportunity. As it turns out, a missed one. Do you think this is going to be something that also will be, a negative entry in the ledger when it comes to, for example, the Biden administration's approach to the war?
Yeah. And again, that's something you've seen come out of kind of like the growing Trump establishment that's forging on the edges of the US Department of Defense. It's like, yes, Ukraine could have been solved if only we had a time machine. We could go back several years and, really, really commit in those first few months. Unfortunately, there's not much we can do in terms of time travel at the moment. So yeah. And I think that's going to play into the incoming Trump narrative, and it's going to be one of the major criticisms of the Biden regime, probably by historians. But yeah, unfortunately, we can't go back and solve that problem. And again, I think that's going to be one of the major points that, the Trump establishment raises as it reduces its commitments in the near future.
And very briefly, also a lesson that, drip feeding doesn't really work in these cases, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, geopolitics, this is a lesson that, great powers seem to need to learn again and again. It's this Vietnam syndrome where you think you can slowly bleed in resources and avoid an overt commitment. Unfortunately, that slowed that initial response. And again, I think this is something that historians are going to judge very harshly.
Chris Morris was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And I'm Jonasz Rewiński. You're watching TVP World. Please do stay with us for more latest news and updates.